Hello and welcome to this screencast on evolution. So this specific screencast is going to be about the first mechanism of evolution, actually the biggest mechanism, which is natural selection. So remember from our four big ideas, the first one is evolution and how it really drives the diversity and unity of all life. We are always going to come back to evolution throughout the whole year, and I hope that we challenge each other to continually connect every concept this year back to evolution. So here's the unit overview for the next 6 weeks we're going to spend on the central theme of biology, which you spent your summer assignment on, which is evolution. So we'll start with mechanisms, and then we'll look at evolution of populations at the the DNA level. Then we'll explore all the different sorts of evidence, and there are lots of different pieces of evidence for evolution. We'll look a little bit at that speciation, how species come about, how they go extinct, and then how did life begin, origin and history of life on Earth. First, very basic, let's get a definition of evolution. Evolution is a change in the genetic makeup of a population over time. So basically, we're looking at this genetic makeup, the DNA, is changing over lots and lots of time, and it's a population, not the individual. The population is evolving. And like I just said, natural selection is the driving mechanism. So that's what we're going to spend most of this video on. There is another mechanism, though, that would be non-adaptive, and we're going to spend the next video talking about sort of random things that can go into making evolution occur. However, the biggest mechanism is adaptive. That would be natural selection, adaptive to a population's environment. And another theme of evolution is this idea of descent with modification, that we all, yes, all of us, all organisms, all life on Earth have evolved over billions of years from one common ancestor. And as we have evolved, we have descended from that common ancestor, but we've modified ourselves, right? We've adapted. So here's just a very simple figure of descent with modification. All of these bacteria came from this one common ancestor, but they have modified to fit their environment, descent with modification. So let's talk a little bit about those adaptations that populations evolve to have for their environment. An adaptation is a trait that provides an advantage to an organism in a particular environment. That is so key to understand, that it is dependent upon the current time and the current environment. Just because something is good in one environment does not mean it's going to be helpful or good in a different environment. And this is so important. If you only take home one thing from this video today, it's this. Organisms do not adapt or evolve. I hope you never hear me say that organisms evolve, and if I do, please correct me. It is populations that adapt and evolve over very, very long periods of time. Now, maybe some of you are a little forgetful of what a population is back from a few years ago. A population is simply the same species living in the same area at the same time. That's what constitutes a population. It's populations that evolve and adapt to their environment through natural selection. Organisms do not evolve during their lifetime. So let's explore this idea of natural selection. There are three very important things you have to know about natural selection. They have to be present before natural selection can occur. So the first is variation. A population must already have two or more different traits or two or more different expressions of a certain trait in their population. And so the question is, well, how does this variation come about in the first place? Maybe you could answer that. The answer is in your DNA. Mutations, meiosis, sexual reproduction, reshuffling of chromosomes and alleles. But variation has to be there to begin with. So for example, hair color in the human population, there's variation. There's brown, there's black, there's blonde, there's red, all different colors. So a diverse gene pool is especially important in a changing environment because then natural selection has more options to choose from. If the environment is constantly changing, hopefully one of those many variations will actually be beneficial or actually help the population in that changing environment. So we have to have variation. In the case of the peppered moth, we have black and we have speckled. All right, the second thing that must be present, that specific variation must also be heritable. It must be able to be passed down to offspring. That is key. And the last one, competition must exist so that there is sort of a fight for survival, and that organism or that population that has that trait is going to survive and survive long enough to reproduce. So you get a reproductive advantage. And then when you reproduce, what happens? You pass that trait on. So there must be competition for resources as well. Here's a very simple graphic of how natural selection occurs. So we start at the top with just one gray dot. Okay, this is our population of dots. Well, first, there has to be some sort of variation. And in this case, we're saying a mutation created that variation. But that variation has to exist first. Then there has to be some sort of environmental change where an unfavorable mutation does not survive. So that white dot does not survive. The gray and the dark gray do survive. They reproduce and they create more of their color. Again, with here, we have another mutation occur to create different shades. These guys are the only ones that survive and reproduce. So you can see that over time, this population has evolved to become more of a gray color instead of a more white color. Okay, so putting this all together, individuals with more favorable phenotypes, and we're going to use the word phenotype a lot. Phenotype is simply a physical characteristic, so an adaptation, a beak size, a hair color, a skin color. Individuals with more favorable phenotypes are more likely to survive, and then they're going to reproduce more offspring, and thus passing on those favorable traits to subsequent generations. This is just fitness. This one word fitness encompasses everything I just said. The more fit you are, okay, not muscle building, not exercise, not nutrition, the more fit you are in an evolutionary sense, the more offspring you're going to reproduce that are going to have those favorable traits. And over time, that population will evolve to look like those favorable traits and have those favorable traits. So the population evolves towards that favorable phenotype. So in this example, maybe a long, thin beak has been beneficial, and these guys are surviving, reproducing, and their offspring also have long, thin beaks. So this is a big idea here. Natural selection acts on phenotypic variations, on physical characteristics. Now this is a little nuance that you have to understand. Natural selection can really only act on phenotypic variation of individuals, right? So an individual with a certain phenotype is either going to survive or it's going to die. But remember that populations evolve. So it's the collection of everything that's happening to the individuals in a population that's going to cause the population to evolve. And again, like I said before, it's entirely dependent on the current environment. The environment affects the rate and the direction of evolution at every single generation. So global warming might be changing, right? Might be changing a population because it's only as good as the current environment. Let's explore these environmental effects. So environments do change and they do act as a selective force on population. However, it is so important to understand that environment does not cause the change. Remember back from a few slides ago, that variation is already present in the population, either through mutation or shuffling of chromosomes through sexual reproduction. Environment does not cause the change. Please understand that. So let's say that we have a change in environment and this population is now in these shallow, warm waters. Well, the individuals that have a better phenotype are going to survive, reproduce in that environment, and have offspring that are also able to survive and reproduce because they have that beneficial trait. So going back to what I said, variation is already present, and how is it present? It's present in the DNA, maybe through a mutation. And so some phenotypic variations significantly increase or possibly decrease fitness of the organism and the population. Remember, simply fitness means how much are you reproducing? Can you reproduce, survive, and reproduce? So let's get a couple examples in of natural selection. The peppered moth. This is a classic example way back in the Industrial Revolution times in New England when we had a lot of factories and a lot of soot. Originally, the peppered moth was this white color. And once we started to get all of this soot, it actually started to change the color of the trees to more of a black color. So what can you imagine about these white moths? They stuck out to their predators, didn't they? So they got eaten, but the ones that had some sort of mutation to be speckled survived because they kind of camouflaged in with that black sooty tree from the factories. So over time, this population evolved to become more speckled because these guys were surviving and they were reproducing and they were passing that trait on. Another example that I created, I'm an artist, if you haven't noticed, I created this. We've got some bugs. We've got some brown bugs and some green bugs on grass. Now, obviously, which one is the predator going to see? The brown bugs. So the brown bugs are going to get eaten. The green bugs are going to survive. They're going to reproduce, and the next generation is going to be green. This is natural selection. I know I'm using a lot of words to explain it. Hopefully you're finding it to be pretty simple. Now, a sort of a variation of natural selection is sexual selection. Maybe it fits underneath the umbrella of natural selection. And there are two types of sexual selection. Intrasexual selection, which is when individuals of one sex compete directly for mates of the opposite sex. So this is common in males fighting over females. Intersexual selection is mate choice. So females most often females, are choosy about what mate they have. And I want you in your video notes to please write down the answer to this question. We'll discuss it in class. How does sexual selection drive evolution? Maybe come up with a specific example of how it could drive the evolution of a population. And we also, humans, have an impact on evolution of populations and species. And this classic example is of artificial selection. When we decide what trait we want to keep going on in the population, we can do this with plants, and we also do this with animals, even with dogs. So an example of corn, we've taken wild corn, and variation obviously already exists. That's a key component. And we've decided to choose only the plumpest seeds to plant for the next generation. We repeat this process for several generations, and over time the quality of the crop increases. This is sort of a summary slide here, and this is such an important idea to understand. Natural selection cannot fashion a perfect organism. In other words, evolution is not goal-oriented. That population does not know that it wants to have wings to fly, and then the next day it gets wings and it flies away. That's not how it works. So there's some reasons for this. First, natural selection can only act on existing variation. New traits don't arise on demand. The environment does not create new traits. Variation must already be there through mutation or through sexual reproduction. Evolution is also limited by historical constraints. What traits are already there from the ancestor? So you can't just overnight grow new structures and new traits. Those structures have to adapt and be modified. So that would be a classic example of how the bat has modified its limbs to be wings. It's a mammal. Adaptations are often compromises. So just because you get something really good out of it, there might be a downside to it. So the human's hands and wrists is a really good example of how that is a compromise. So we have very, very good dexterity, but it's not very sturdy, is it? Those bones are very, I wouldn't say brittle, but you could break them fairly easily. And lastly, chance, natural selection, and the environment all interact together to form evolution of a population. We've already discussed natural selection and how the environment interacts, and in the next video, we're going to discuss this chance component, this non-adaptive component to evolution. So keep in mind that all four of these things are going on, and that natural selection is not perfect. Evolution is not perfect. Now, at the end of your video notes, at the end of pretty much every video notes, they're going to have some questions. In this case, there are 4 questions. And on the day the video notes are due, I'm going to collect them, and I'm also going to look over your answers to these questions. So pause your video and write down your answers to these questions. And I hope you enjoyed video 1 of evolution.